Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really privileged to be here right now with our FCC Chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel, a great public servant, a creature of Washington in the best way, as somebody who has incredible Hill experience and has sort of been in this communication technology space in an era of serious transformation, and has really kind of seen big changes both in broadcast and radio, but at a time when the internet has changed our lives and cable and streaming have changed the way all of us are communicating and kind of dealing with a lot of that structural change. So we're going to kind of get into it. I'm so pleased that you're here. This will be kind of a fun one and I think a very nourishing conversation for folks in the room. So let's get to it. Because I think one thing that people don't understand is I think how much of the communications work is actually essential in matters of equitable access. And I know it's something you think about a lot as a net neutrality warrior. But getting into the data, I want to just kind of remind folks of some of the issues that I know you deal with. 40% of black households don't have high-speed broadband in this country, compared to about 28% of white households. Many rural communities trail far behind urban and suburban ones in broadband access and smartphones and tablets and desktops. Talk to us a little bit about the FCC's work in that area and equity and gains since you've been chairwoman.
All right. Well, thank you, Dafna, for having me here. Thank you to U.S. News and World Report. And also thank you for starting with a big question about digital equity. It is so important. And if we needed an object lesson, I would say 4 years ago during the pandemic, we were all told to go home, hunker down, and live life online. Yeah. It's just not clear that everyone was able to do so. So coming out of the pandemic, Congress on a bipartisan basis set up a lot of new programs to make sure that broadband infrastructure reaches rural communities that don't have service. But it also tasked the Federal Communications Commission with developing policies to help households that can't afford service. And using that authority, my agency created the Affordable Connectivity Program. And because it's Washington, we tend to just call it the ACP. We can't resist our acronyms in this town. But the ACP is the largest broadband affordability effort in our nation's history. 23 million households rely on it to get online and stay online. Those are households with kids in the free and reduced lunch program at school, households that depend on SNAP and Medicaid. Now, it's been a wild success, but regrettably, Congress has not stepped up to continue to fund that program. And the way I see it is that this program is really vital for full participation in modern life, and we're going to have to keep working with Congress to make sure they continue it.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that, because the funding just sort of just last week kind of came to a conclusion. That's right. And I think, you talked about that sort of staying in the modern world. I mean, I think internet access is about doing homework and starting businesses and...
You don't have a fair shot at success if you don't have internet access at home. It's that essential.
Yeah.
You're going to need it for schoolwork. You're going to need it for many jobs. You're going to need it to look for a job. I mean, 80% of the Fortune 500 companies require you to apply online. And so many people now need it for healthcare because those follow-up appointments, which can sometimes be inconvenient, you can now take them through telemedicine.
Right. Talk a little bit about this phrase that you've coined that I kind of can't get over. I love it so much, the homework gap.
Yeah.
And how to bridge that, something that sort of came out of COVID especially.
So the way I sometimes describe the homework gap is I think back to my own childhood. I mean, if I wanted to do homework, all it took was paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. That was the hard one, that last one. But these days, every child needs an internet connection, not just in school, but also at home. And one thing that struck me as I went around and visited schools nationwide in rural communities and urban communities alike. The teachers would talk about bringing these new technologies into their classroom, but lacking confidence that every student had the internet access at home they needed to actually follow up on their school assignments. And instead of just calling that the digital divide, I started calling it the homework gap. What's really neat is Congress has stepped up to try to address it and give us some authority, especially during the pandemic, to try to address that need and help those kids who were stuck at home, unable to go to online class and do their nightly schoolwork.
Right. There are some other federal programs that can kind of sort of step in while we're sort of hanging around for the ACB to get reauthorized. Are those helpful? Do you see those as kind of bridges in this period, or you feel like we're creating more vulnerability suddenly again?
I worry about us making so much progress and now losing some of the gains we've made. So we're taking a look at existing programs and identifying ways to modernize them. It's not always easy with technology. It changes faster than the underlying laws. But the FCC for decades has had a program called E-Rate, which helps connect low-income schools and libraries nationwide. And we're, for instance, looking at how that program can also support the loaning out of hotspots at schools and libraries nationwide, which I think could be really helpful and effective for low-income communities and people who need that access at home.
Yeah, they also need to be able to get to the libraries.
Yeah.
We need more libraries.
That's true too.
So that would be helpful.
Yeah.
I want to just turn for a minute, just because, as you know, AI is exciting and scary. I read Reid Hoffman, one of the founders of LinkedIn and others, it said something last week that struck me. He said, AI, with its availability, patience, and simulated empathy, can have a profound impact on humanity at large. Not everyone has reliable access to human kindness and support, but when that becomes something you can have on tap, it increases your own capacity for being able to be kind to others. And then exactly a week later, former, current, and OpenAI and Google employees just yesterday published this open letter warning about the advances, saying they pose serious risks, including a loss of control of systems, potentially resulting in human extinction. Perhaps you share the excitement and the worry. Can you talk a little bit about this?
I got both extremes right there, didn't you?
Yeah. Where are you?
I think we do have an excess of pessimism when it comes to this technology. And I think, if we know that bad actors might use it, how about if, as good actors, we wrap our arms around it and identify some positive things to do?
Yeah.
What if you can start recognizing patterns at radical scale? What does that mean for medicine? What does it mean for the efficiency of how we use our airwaves? What does it mean for our capacity to identify junk on our communications networks like robocalls? To me, there are a lot of positive use cases, but I think we have to find the courage to be optimists and do something to make them happen.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the robocalls. Just so everyone knows, the FCC ruled that about AI-generated robocalls are out of the game.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of what led you to come by that, and a little bit about, just because we are in an election cycle, is that something that you think can take effect in this cycle?
So for starters, let's begin with something we all agree on, which is that robocalls are awful.
Who here loves robocalls? No one?
Yeah, and also not terrific is that the primary law we have at the Federal Communications Commission to oversee robocalls is from 1991. Yeah. I mean, in 1991, that's when most phones involved a jack in the wall and a curly cord. I still have to explain that to the young people in my office. So this law is old. But we started seeing with AI, voice cloning in robocalls was new.
Yeah.
And in particular, as many of you might recall, President Biden's voice was cloned and called a whole bunch of voters in New Hampshire just before the New Hampshire primary. And he offered them information about where and when to vote that was totally inaccurate. So needless to say, this is not a good thing. It disrupts our election process. I felt that way, and the New Hampshire Attorney General felt that way. And so we joined forces and had a bipartisan effort to track down the individual responsible. And
you did.
We did. We fined that individual for violating communications laws, and the New Hampshire Attorney General sought to criminally prosecute that individual. At the same time, we identified the carrier carrying that junk on their line, fined them too. So I think in what is, it was really swift, working together and making this happen, and we were trying to send a clear signal in advance of the election that if you engage in this junk, we're going to find you.
How difficult is it to, as you said, deal with laws on the books that just are completely disconnected from technology today? I mean, that's a real struggle.
I think what you do is you look at those laws and you see what values are in them. Openness, access for all, preventing fraud, and you find ways to give them modern meaning. That's the way I look at our role right now at the Federal Communications Commission, whereas you said at the start, digital technology has changed everything. It's scrambled so much of what we thought we used to know. So I think looking at those values in our laws that are time-tested is where you should start.
And as you said, I mean, there was no cable and internet back then when the FCC started, and a lot of these rules were on the books. You have oversight over broadcast and radio. How do you juggle the divide? How do we protect consumers and election integrity and voters and access when part of that world falls under you and part of it doesn't?
Right.
And how can voters tell the difference if they're seeing something on television, on broadcast, or hearing something on the radio and then seeing something streaming on their phone?
I know, for the average consumer, that's just all media. That's just all content. They're indifferent to the distribution means.
Right.
And yet legally, if you distribute that content over radio or television, or over cable or satellite, or over the internet, it's subject to radically different legal regimes. And if you had a wand today and you could simplify things, I'm sure you might consider using it. But there's no such magic available to us. Instead, not yet. We have the laws that are on the books. And so you look at them and you try to understand what you can do with the powers you have. And for instance, I just proposed to my colleagues on the artificial intelligence front that we require advertisements for candidates and campaigns to simply disclose if they use AI technology or not. For decades, the FCC has had policies requiring every single campaign ad to file in a public place saying who sponsored them, what they paid for it, and when it ran. So we're just suggesting they should also disclose whether or not they've used AI technology in that advertisement. And while that would be limited to radio and television broadcasts under the law, I think it sets a really helpful baseline. It's premised on the idea that disclosure matters and transparency matters. And I think when it comes to AI, that's the right place to start.
I appreciate that so much, especially on the transparency front, and especially in an election year. Give me an example of sort of where the vulnerabilities are there. Sort of how do we understand what might be at stake without knowing, without the disclosure? In other words, what would we be seeing that would trip us up or surprise us? And a disclosure would help kind of open our eyes a little bit more.
There's
on
so much, as we know, there's so much
presented.
potential to manipulate voices and images using artificial intelligence. That can be used for good, it can be used for ill, but by just simply having a disclosure, we're not making a judgment. We're just saying you, as the consumer, the viewer, the citizen, the listener, you should just know.
Yeah, that sounds like, I would like to know.
I would too.
Yeah.
I would too.
And let me ask you just, it was such a good example from what happened in New Hampshire with the robocalls, but enforcement's tough. There's got to be a lot of obstacles there and challenges, and working at the state level and at the federal level. especially because states are sort of running their own elections, and there's a lot of elections out there. How do you deal with that, both the investigative side, finding the person, and also just enforcing the rules?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, artificial intelligence technology to clone our voices is cheap and easy.
Cheap and easy.
And can be done at enormous scale. So this is a huge challenge. It's why we acted so fast and so clearly in the case in New Hampshire. But one thing that's become apparent to me is we can't do this sitting here in Washington by our own. So I've gone to the state attorneys general in every state, and I've gotten 49 of them to sign up on a memorandum of understanding. Yeah, saying that they'll work with us on robocalls, because they're going to hear in their own backyard what's happening before I do. And if we can develop a relationship where they tell me, well, they can try to go find out the individual responsible. I can start tracing back on the network where that call came from. And if we work together, we might be able to hold those people accountable a lot faster. So the really neat thing is some of our best work to stop robocalls has been this kind of joint federal-state activity, and state attorneys general have been really a formidable partner for us at the FCC in this effort.
Fascinating. Okay, so who's the holdout?
Nebraska, just come on in. The water's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they're.
We're going to still work on it. I'm very relentless. We're going to get them on board.
I'm gonna root for Nebraska. So I guess I should just ask you too, just because we're talking about this and election integrity. I mean, we did in 2016, as the Justice Department has made clear. I mean, we did have foreign interference in our election online with Russian troll farms. Do you see concerns about that again? You have a better kind of insight than most of us do. What should voters be sort of wary of in this moment? Look, if someone gains advantage by exploiting our openness culturally and economically, I think they might strive to take advantage, right? But I think the most important thing is that consumers on whatever media they consume should expect some disclosure. Is artificial intelligence being used? Was this the creation of a foreign governmental entity? These are things we can know and require disclosure about, and I think that's the road we should pursue. Yeah, so that's interesting, and a good use of disclosure. It would sort of separate the real and the technology from something that might be foreign interference. And I think rather prudently wouldn't put government in the position of deciding what's true or false, because that creates a First Amendment problem that's unacceptable. It's not within our constitutional tradition. But I think disclosure is about being honest to who's watching you, listening to you, and consuming what you put out there. Yeah, so that I think I was going to say, you know, we're 152 days out from the election, but honestly, but who's counting? Well, honestly, with early voting, we're actually much closer. Because there is so much early voting at the end of the summer across the country in many states, which kind of takes me back to that. You know, are we moving quickly enough? You know, on some of the bigger proposals when it comes to disclosure, to kind of give people a little bit more of a sense of security and integrity, and sort of the ads and what they're seeing and reading. Well, I'm an impatient optimist, so I think we should move faster. I wish we could move faster, but I think if we are smart about what we do, we'll be able to manage some of what's coming our way. Okay, great. We only have a minute left, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to just chat a little bit, because I said at the beginning, you're such a net neutrality warrior. And you know, some of these policies, as you know very well from your time in Washington, they come and go. How do you fireproof you know, important policies so that they don't get kind of pulled from one administration to the other? Especially for stuff like this that's so vital. Yeah, net neutrality is just a legal commitment to internet openness, so you as a consumer can go where you want and do what you want online, and your broadband provider doesn't set up sweetheart deals with some websites and shut down others so you can't access them.
I think it's a good thing. 80% of the public supports it, and so we put it back in the law. When we did that, we made sure to put it back in the law in a way where it has previously been upheld in court. So I think that gives us some measure of security going forward, though I'm absolutely certain there will be more litigation, because one thing I've learned running an agency in Washington is there's always a lawyer who's willing to come out and tell you, you should rethink your policies in court. But I'm confident in the work my team has done on this, and I think net neutrality should be a feature of the internet in the United States.
Great, thank you. Please help me thank the chairwoman. We're so lucky to spend time with her. Thank you. Wonderful.